Okay, last paper of this two-day conference, and Stefan unfortunately couldn't be here, but I'm so very grateful that you can join us virtually and present your paper from a distance. Professor Stefan Link is Associate Professor of History at Dartmouth College and a specialist in the history of global political economy and the intellectual history of capitalism. He's the author of Forging Global Fordism, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Contest Over the Industrial Order, which came out from Princeton in 2020. The book won the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize for European History from the American Historical Association, the Stuart L. Burnett Prize for the History of American Foreign Relations, awarded by the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and was runner-up for the 2021 Michael H. Hunt Prize for International or Global History, also from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. The book received a Toynbee Prize Foundation Roundtable. Is currently working on a book on the global history of the Great Depression. I first encountered Stefan, I believe, in the Weatherhead Initiative, and followed by that in 2015 at Professor Charles Mayer's 75th birthday and the conference that happened surrounding that. So good to see you again, Stefan. It's yours.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Okay, so I want to thank Amitava, Daniel, and Heather, obviously, for giving me the opportunity to participate here. I would have very much liked to be there in person. My entire family was stricken with a bad bout of COVID, and I'm still recovering. So if my voice sounds funny to you, it's because it does. And if I break out in a coughing fit or stumble over my words here, I hope you'll bear with me. I also should say that on my end, the Zoom connection, listening in over the last 2 days, it has been very interesting, but it sometimes went in and out a little bit, delaying transmission. So I hope that won't be too disrupted, but just a heads up that may maybe garble what comes out at your end, or prevent me from entirely understanding, maybe later in the conversation what you're saying. So I might have to ask you to repeat some of the questions. Now, so when Amitava invited me, asked me to contribute a paper, actually just at the beginning of the term, I guess as a pinch hitter, I was glad to say yes, because it allowed me to just put in writing some thoughts about global history that, as these things are, I've carried around with me for a while, and hadn't had occasion to sit down and actually put into writing. So this was a wonderful opportunity. But that said, so this is just a kind of short reflection paper, really. It's not unlike some of the other presentations many of the other presentations that we've heard over the past 2 days. It's not part of a larger project at all. So what I wanted to do is think a little bit about the role that states have played in global history as it is now and has recently been practiced, and connect that to a little bit of a larger point about the state of the field and some of the critiques that have been articulated to global history, but also the way that global history as a field has responded. And so what I do in the paper is, and I simply begin by noting that there's periodically a criticism of the field of global history, that it is a little bit too sanguine about the processes of interconnection that are so of such great interest to global historians, and that in that being the case, the entire endeavor of the field echoes too closely for comfort the kind of boosterism that attended millennial globalization, the globalization speak of the turn of the millennium and really the first decade of the 2000s. So you all know the famous critique by Jeremy Edelman that I'm referring to here, David Bell's critique that was part of this exchange. The late J.J. Pocock articulated a very interesting critique of global history and insisting of what he called the unglobality of certain contexts. Recently, Quinn Slobodian has asked, what are we doing when we as educators train students in global history? Are we simply producing what he called useful savants? So are we simply endowing our students with intercultural competencies that they will that are most useful in the world of 21st century business consulting? Jeremy Edelman also, in his critique, if you recall, made the point that the focus on connection is no longer apposite in a time of resurgent ethno-nationalism and renewed geopolitical competition. So one should also, increasingly pay attention to resistances to integration, detachments from connection, et cetera, et cetera. And now, as a field, I thought a little bit of how's the field responded? I mean, there have been some explicit rebuttals to that, but mostly, if we simply look at what historians do, global historians do, and obviously the field is much too large for any individual to really oversee, but I hope I'm getting at some core themes here. It's interesting, I think. So the recent years have produced a whole sequence of scholarship on what one might call non-liberal cross-border networks, so, fascist internationals, Catholic internationals, illiberal internationalism. That's been a big topic. And, the response to the small scale, historians have insisted over and over again, I think very rightly, that actually the interplay between different scales, and especially the interplay between the local and the global, has in fact been a major preoccupation of global history. Is also something that has come up repeatedly over the last 2 days. Far from assuming that global integration flattens, global historians insist over and over again that we actually have to look at processes of differentiation. Another theme that has come up, I think, over the last 2 days. And finally, so to Edelman's charge, what do global historians do in a world of resurging nationalism? Well, there has been a lot of interest in pushback against globalization. So I'll just point to the research center in Munich that Heidi already alluded to yesterday, Global Disconnect, which is dedicated to the idea of connectivity in processes of globalization, or just point to Tara Zera's recent book on anti-globalism. I think represents that trend very nicely. Now, what I want to do is I want to go a step further and say, I actually don't think that really solves the problem, or it takes the entire sting out of the critique to oppose connection with its antonyms. To say, of course, we're not naive about connection. We know that connection is not apolitical or uncomplicated, is shot through with interruption and disconnectivity. So this preoccupation with differentiation, interruption, and illiberal connectivity, my sense is, does not entirely overcome let's say the coincidence of the field of global history as it is currently practiced and has risen over the last 20 years with the vocabulary and discourse of globality that has no longer fashionable, but was very fashionable for let's say a decade and a half between the 90s and the early 2000s. And one way to see this, I'd argue, is by looking at the way global historians have treated the state. And so, if you just ask about what role does the state play in global histories? And again, these things are hard to do, to sort of overgeneralize. So I hope I'm I'm able to generalize here a little bit without undue simplification. So I think it's fair to say that states, have not been necessarily at the center of global historians' interest. We like to talk about empires, capital in particular. I think that has been clear over the last 2 days too, has garnered a lot of interest from the field, international organizations. Thinking about the 3 large agents of transformation, borrowing here from Charlie Mayer's recent book on the project state. So he talks about empires, capital, international organizations, and governance, and states. So I think states probably have received the least attention, which is not surprising because, as everyone knows, as we all know, global history arose as a critique of nationally framed historiography, which in ways that, again, have been articulated so eloquently again over the last 2 days, were confining to many of the questions that interested us. So there is maybe a certain methodological anti-statism that's kind of fundamental for the entire endeavor of global history. So to ask about sub-state and superstate actors and to be impatient with the narrative of modernization that kind of concludes with the modern nation state, and also narratives of modernization that really take the nation state as their operative frame. Yes, that's almost definitional of global history, isn't it? And there's maybe another element to it, as Richard Drayton and David Mottedale noted in their famous response to Jeremy Edelman. Global history is drawn kind of normative energy from the social histories from below, the 60s and 70s, from subaltern studies. And what I would add to that is, I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say that a very strong, if you want, intellectual, temperamental sensibility running through these fields was a skepticism of states. These fields drew in various ways on Foucault, on, say, Jim Scott, or maybe on the Marxist conception of the state as the bourgeois executive arm. But that said, states are hardly absent from global histories. I think this also became clear again over the last 2 days. They are in a field that, for many people, takes it as definitional, that it studies things, people, ideas, networks that transcend boundaries, cross borders. These borders are often implicitly or explicitly understood to have been drawn and put up by nation states. So if there's a kind of negative foil, if you want, that states definitely figure in global history, but they also figure as actors. And so in 3 ways, and here I want to focus more, more narrowly, I guess, on a sub-theme or sub-field of global history, which is the history of globalization of the 19th and 20th century, which has taken many forms, but let me try and do that. And so in this narrative, states feature in 3 ways. And so Sven has actually just in his talk earlier, I think re-articulated a version of this. Full disclosure here, Sven was one of my dissertation advisors, so I'm sure he won't mind if I take him as an exemplar here. So I'm going back to Sven's Cotton book, a kind of paradigmatic work of global history. And if you look at what the state does there, well, it's essentially it is an executive arm of the instatement of global capitalist relations in the 19th century. And I think this is very successful, obviously. The idea that global capitalism arose spontaneously, peacefully expanding circles of manufacturing and trade is completely untenable. What Beckert did in that book very successfully is just showing the violence, the coercion, and sustained political activism that it in fact took to create a world market, a global a system of global capitalism. And he has various examples of this, from plantation slavery to the refashioning of of the economic geography of India, which I think plays a big role in the Cotton Book from the deindustrialization of India and the British. It's kind of an engineering of this economic geography into the supply of cotton. And then states feature in a second vein, and this is usually associated with the interwar period as orchestrators of kind of a backlash, a reaction against globalization. But it's not restricted to the interwar period. I think this is very much in Polanyian fashion. Polanyi's classic diagnosis of a double movement where market impositions provoke self-defense on the part of society. And but the kind of archetypical period of that is usually being put to use is the interwar period, where states retreat into protectionism and autarky. But here, so the state is a kind of antagonist of capitalist integration, or as Harold James puts it, kind of emblematically, I think, the state was seen by many as a safety device or shield against the problems of the international economic order. And in interesting ways, this story is often tied to the expansion of franchise in the European core, where states are no longer able to impose the kind of economic costs on their population because they're more beholden to working class constituencies. And then there's a third way in which the state appears in global history, which is as a kind of accomplice of neoliberal globalization since the 1970s. And there the narrative is usually something along the lines of this. So, coming out of the Depression and World War II, you had states, at least in the core, that were to some extent dedicated to redistribution, perhaps economic development, but they were unable to deal with the crises of the 1970s, inflation, oil and industrial decline, the profitability crises of the 1970s, the reshuffling of the, again, economic geography of the world. And in that, coming out of that, by the 1980s, states become, if you want, alacritous enablers of the newly aggressive capitalist agenda of disempowering labor, clearing the way for financialization and multinational corporations. And so there are many versions of this. Excuse me. I think it's interesting to think about contributions from Vanessa Ogle or Amy Offner recently in her book, Sorting Out the Mixed Economy, who emphasized that, in the Americas, welfare and developmental states, kind of public-private compromises or relationships that were characteristic of that state, in many ways rehearsed, in her view, the hollowing out of the public sector that came to dominate the neoliberal era. And I think Charlie Mayer's recent book on the project state is a very, if you want, presents a version of this narrative. So the ambitions of the project state, be they liberal or illiberal in the 20th century, by the late 20th century, they collapse into a kowtow to capital and international governance. And so I want to emphasize again that there is here much that is indispensable in this narrative, reiterating again the imperial state as the coercive engine of the making of 19th century market integration, I think, is indispensable. Nation states are clearly the locus of all sorts of reactions to capitalist integration. And yes, they have clearly been co-architects of a real existing neoliberalism in ways, however, that I actually don't think we've entirely yet understood. I think that also remains an empirical question. But it does seem to me that it leaves out something crucial. In all of these veins, the state is, appears in a kind of relationship to the needs, which is sometimes seen to be just simply autonomous or self-generating, the needs of global capitalist expansion. So, enabler or reactionary, enabler or antagonist. So, deferent or hyperreactive. We have very little sense of how states act autonomously. So the state kind of remains a black box. Capitalists call it in when they need an emergency fixer. And for sure, the state has often worked in that way. But is that all there is to it? And so I think if we restrict our analysis of the state to that, we miss a lot of stuff. We miss how states are in fact major co-constituents of the political architecture of the world. We can't, it seems to me, entirely plausibly explain a world that is organized according to the political logic of nation states. We miss how nation states, remain the backbone of many of the other things that interest us, international organizations, and whom they fund, whom they constitute, and where, if you want, nation states power struggles take place. And we also, I think, most importantly, kind of misanalyzing how the borders that we assume states draw, in fact, are complex mechanisms of managing the political and economic realities of the world, not simply kind of tools for reactive interruption. And so I think we missed something crucial. We finally, I don't think, can really explain what seems to me is really the next big horizon in terms of, what's the big narrative after we've given up on the triumph of the West, a long time ago. I've heard about the failure of the West today. I very much sympathize with that. But, from where I'm sitting, what isn't the really big story here the one of reconvergence and a kind of narrative that takes the longer history of China as, if you want, archetypical, that sees the age of European expansion and supremacy as a kind of 200-year blip that is more of an aberration and is fast coming to an end, and we're looking at an entirely different world. So the kind of obsessions that we used to have, I'm sort of excited by this direction. Which seems to me a kind of tonic to Eurocentrism that is more convincing. It obviously has precursors if you think of the work of André Gunder Frank, etc. Anyway, so it seems to me that looking at states is absolutely crucial. And so if we want to understand, not a history of integration and disintegration, but a political history of the structure of the world. And so what I do in the paper is just have kind of 3 bullet points, really. It's no more than that, of what kind of avenues of inquiry a global history might pursue. And maybe just say one more thing before that. Well, I should probably. So let me just say one more thing before that, which is, it's interesting to think about what happened to the state. This goes back to the question of, if you want, the unwitting ideological complicity of the language of global history with the discourse of globality, which is obviously neoliberal. It's very fascinating to go back to American social science literature of the 80s and 90s, and especially the agenda of bringing the state back in. Which was somehow eclipsed by the discourse of globalization. So this state-centered scholarship never really went away, but it became unfashionable. And by the 90s, because of the ascendance of kind of orthodox into economics, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, also because, I think this is often underrated, the United States, in the 70s and 80s was actually a very anxious place, maybe, kind of reminiscent of what's going on today vis-a-vis China, a very anxious place in terms of anxiety about economic competitiveness, no longer, the Soviet Union and the Cold War, but economic competitiveness vis-a-vis Japan. And by the late 1990s, that fear had completely dissipated. And so I think, these were factors that paved the way for this kind of triumphalist discourse of globality. So I wonder if there's a way to recover some of the intuitions of that earlier literature without necessarily recovering its, if you want, realist nihilism. But if you think about how people talked about world order. Yes, in the 1980s, it was much more talk about competing centers of power rather than economic and cultural convergence. Globalization is very much about economic and cultural convergence. And a multiverse, the planet as being divided in a multiverse, and the relationship between these power centers was mediated and complex, and not subject to assimilation and integration. Competition was political, not a market concept. Governing, not governance. Structure, not connection. Geopolitics instead of globalization. Anyway, so how might one recover a sense of this? So the first, I think the most important one, is to think about developmental statecraft. And so what's developmental statecraft? I think it's been underappreciated because for some reason historians, maybe because of this kind of anti-statist sensibility, but historians have really not spent much time thinking about this and left really all of the work to social scientists, which is a shame. But it's simply the question, what roles do states in fact play in economic transformation? And how this works, social scientists have covered this at the example of East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan in particular, but more recently in China. So the concept of the developmental state, now often applied to China, as I just said. I myself have tried, to apply it with a colleague, Noam Magor, to 19th century American industrialization. And what is developmental statecraft? Well, broadly speaking, it's a political response to the economic hierarchies instilled by Western preponderance since the 19th century. So domestic coalitions emerge that decide that there are real weaknesses and dim prospects for growth, development, flourishing, but also military and economic power. That if you're stuck in an economic structure which is dominated by agriculture, low wages and low skills, but we all know this. Whether we like it or not, I think this is what the historical record clearly shows, that in catch-up or late development becomes an overweening political goal. And to do this, however, states are actually quite activist and directive. They set prices wrong, they harness markets, they not only kowtow to capital, but in fact discipline capital. They harness capital to the political goal of development, and only then, in fact, does it work. This is interesting for the structure of world order because, as I say in the paper a little bit, especially. So, what is the key? What is the key? Puzzle of late for late developers is access to capital and access to technology. And the problem, the catch-22 of late development, is that capital and technology reside in the developed West / the developed North, against whom you're trying to compete, or from whom you're trying to wean yourself. So you're always kind of forced into, if you want to kind of pact with the devil or a relationship with the devil. But so managing how foreign capital is used and managing how foreign technology is imported and indigenized and translated into indigenous innovation is actually a key process. So I could say more about that. They're interesting. I think it's a ubiquitous theme which really almost cries out for historical recovery. The examples I use in the paper are Japan and more recently China. I'll skip over the second mode, which is, for better or worse, economic statecraft in the name of national security. I'll just say this: the gadgets that all of you have on your laps right now, the fact that I'm zooming in here, none of this is really possible without techno-scientific innovation policy that was state-driven in the name of national security. And we ignore this at our peril. We don't examine it. We can't leave this story to political scientists, is all I'm saying. The final point I'm making is, what's the point of statehood in the first place? Again, why did we emerge with a world full of states in the 20th century? And I think it's interesting to listen to the voices of anti-colonial nationalists there who talk about freedom and democracy, obviously, as well they should. but who often, when pressed, what is it going to mean in practice to have state? To talk about economic motives, managing your own economic affairs, managing especially external economic affairs. So being able to pursue independent monetary and fiscal policies, being able to impose tariffs and manage trade, being able to supervise capital flow, being able to see how technology is being invested, being transferred and used and indigenized is actually a really important part of what the discourse of anti-colonial nationalism, but also what states actually do. If you look at what do states in fact do, I'm not saying it's the only thing, but I think that's a big part of it. So I think Atul Kohli has put this really well in his recent book on imperialism in the developed world. Anti-imperial movements realize that in a world of imperialism, national sovereignty is an economic asset that allows you to, in fact, use the state not as an enforcer of capital relations, but as an instrument to manage hierarchies in the global economic order. Call them capitalism or not. I think in that dynamic we can fold in real existing communism too. So yes, I'll end with that, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Questions for Stefan Link? Julia.
Hi there. Thank you very much for this. It's a bit of an unfair question, but I suppose to me, this whole history, the whole place of the state in global history looks very different from the early modern period, right? Because a lot of there's been a lot of recognition of the co-constitutive nature of the state and capitalism in the early modern period, and fantastic work in early modern intellectual history on, for example, corporate constitutionalism and the way that states franchise sovereignty in order to expand empire. And I think that literature in particular has kind of blurred the boundaries between state and empire. And so, I know it's kind of unfair saying, well, look at the early modern period, but maybe there's something there.
No, absolutely. I think the way I was trying to slice this is by thinking about the narrative of global capitalist integration in the 19th and 20th century in particular, and the kind of capacities that states develop, which I think diversify and become more powerful. Obviously we could debate definitionally. Where do empires end? Where do states begin? What is the imperial state, et cetera, et cetera. I think what's important to me is again, not in a way of saying, oh, global historians have ignored the state and we should really talk about it, but think about a particular way in which the political economy of the globe, which we are interested in the modern period, is structured, which I think we miss extremely influential and important ways by not figuring, by assuming, I think that states can only enact or react to capital. It's a modern perspective. I admit that.
Maxine.
Thank you. I'll just pursue the issues on the early modern. I haven't read a lot of this literature on the developmental state, but there's been some use of it by Pincus and Robinson to discuss the connections between the late 17th, early 18th century British state and the West Indies, citing examples of British state investment in harbors and clear-ups after hurricanes, etc. I'm pretty skeptical about this. I mean, this is a colonial possession, what is the developmental aspect of this?
I think, so I don't know this, but thanks for pointing it out, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I think it just goes to show that, economic statecraft is, first of all, pervasive, extremely powerful, and can go in different directions. So British imperial economic statecraft was, of course, not aimed towards the development of the colonies in their own right, but aimed towards making, if we take as an example India, going here after Manu Goswami's work, to some extent Sven's work as well. But what does the imperial state do? It first funds, backstops the railroads, and owns them outright. It builds much of the infrastructure, and it does that with a certain goal, which is creating a division of labor across the empire, which exchanges raw materials from the colony with manufactured goods from Lancashire, but other parts of from Britain, as it were, and economic nationalists of the time say, first of all, what you're doing is not laissez-faire, and I think they're right, and also we want to do this ourselves on our own account. We want to be more like Germany and Japan, who use economic statecraft for, nationalist developmentalist goals. So the fact that it can be used for, imperial infrastructure, does not, I think, contradict the fact that historically it has been used to build economic leverage against empire, which is really the big story of the 20th century. And so what I find instructive about the developmental state literature is, there are many things, but it's really, it's really two things. One is to think of, it really gives us, I think, an operable way of overcoming state market distinctions, in the sense that states do not only respond to markets or regulate them, but in fact actively shape markets. It really gives you a sense of the political, how markets are politically constituted. It gives you a sense of how state policy, economic statecraft, emerges out of political conflicts. This is often, elite contestation, but elites also, represent certain factions of society. And finally, it draws attention to the fact that if we think about countervailing forces to capital, the state can be a countervailing force. One of the more interesting notions of the developmental state literature is that of disciplining capital, which late developers realize this all the time. If you give foreign capital or national capital simply everything it needs, it will do whatever it wants. It will not produce development or not create economic outcomes that in some way or in any way accord with the public good, or whatever the state defines as the public good. That's precisely the question. So the state is in a relationship with capital, which is not simply reactive or a kind of toady. It is, in fact, if you want a kind of sometimes a disciplinarian, so carrots and sticks. And I think, why is this important? Well, if we want to understand, I guess this is, if the challenge, going back to Edelman, if the challenge is to understand the world today, and saying we can't just talk about connection, because what we're seeing here is really a resurgence of political conflict and disconnection, then I think what it misstates the challenge a little bit. The challenge is not that there are all these reactions against connection, though no doubt they are taking place. The challenge is that we are facing a world in which states have been and are activist, in shaping global order in ways that we, I think, have yet to fully explain and explore. And so just as a gate into thinking about, political histories of the state, this is where I like to, this is where I find the developmental state literature useful.
John.
Stefan, John McNeil here. You seem to endorse the formula that in an age of imperialism, national sovereignty is an economic asset. I wonder if you would accept the following amendment, friendly amendment, that in an age of imperialism, national sovereignty is an economic asset with a modest at best probability of being converted into a real economic asset. I say this because the experience of, let us say, 19th century and early 20th century Japan in an age of imperialism has to be put in the balance against the 19th and early 20th century experience of Thailand, Ethiopia, Liberia, Guatemala. They had national sovereignty in an age of imperialism, but it doesn't seem to have done them anywhere near as much good. It seems to me lots of things have to fall into place before that formula can be considered true.
So I think there are two things. First of all, it's a precondition. It's clearly not a sufficient condition. But to the extent that there have been, if you want, pushbacks, successful pushbacks, which have been state-led against the global division of labor that the Age of Empire created, they have been, in fact, led by states. Not everyone can do it, which depends on, all sorts of things, formal and informal empire, the legacies of empire, obviously. It also depends on the political coalitions that end up, if you want, dictating developmental policy. But it's not like there's no pattern there at all or no learning experience at all. And the other thing I would say is that it is instructive to simply think about, again, if you read the voices of, anti-colonial nationalists, how they talk about the economy and why they think statehood is important, these issues matter. Obviously, it contends with a power differential in which empires and former empires, retain an enormous amount of power and often try and undermine precisely these, developmental efforts. So the point is not to deny hierarchy here at all. In fact, I think it draws attention to the way these hierarchies are structured in a much sharper form. I think that's what I would say to that. I mean, this is the way I understand Colby, saying it. The idea that sovereignty has not mattered because of informal empire would be way overstating the case in the other direction. It is a precondition for, for a kind of effective economic transformation that overturns the development hierarchies that are a spawn of the 19th century.
Thank you. Ksenia.
Thank you. This is Ksenia. I'm a graduate student. And actually, I think your last answer kind of touched on this already. So we'll see how far we get with this question. And I also want to preface this by saying that I am not a 20th century historian. So to me, I don't know what you guys out there in the wilds of 20th century or history are dealing with the disappearance of states as actors. And maybe this in the early modern and 19th century, maybe we just don't have the same trouble. But I'm wondering if maybe what a different way of framing the problem you're noticing is that it's nation states that are the blips, and that really the state that you're talking about is empire, and that maybe is the most useful way of thinking about the relationship or the mutually constitutive relationship between capitalism and state, and the role of states in all these various economic functions, I guess.
Yeah, whether the kind of nation state that, again, for better or worse, has proliferated over the 19th and 20th century is here to stay is an open question. My interest is, and it's almost a kind of old school world history interest. There used to be a big literature concerning, where do empires come from? What kind of, if you want, political problems do they address? In the whole literature, empires are in many ways processors of political difference. Often, more often than not, most often in terms of hierarchy, but also, in kind of terms that are negotiated. One thinks about the Ottoman Empire or the Habsburg Empire. So, you might say about that literature, you can critique it. I think what's attractive about it, it asks a question, an interpretive question about the emergence of particular political formations that is useful if we think about the emergence of states, which I think is not an accident. It's not credible that they simply proliferate because, Europe overran the world in the 19th and 20th century. But again, I think this is a hypothesis. But I think I wonder if it's worth bearing out. States proliferate because they give you the mechanisms. They give political elites the mechanisms to manage the fallout from imperialism. Nationalism is, an anti-imperial is an anti-imperial movement. Most nationalisms define themselves in one way or another as anti-imperialist. So a collapse of state power and imperial power does not seem advisable to me. I think we have to make we have to look closely about what kind of political formations do what and how. I'll say one more thing about what Sven said earlier. Sven, are you there? I can't actually see you, but about how capitalism and states co-constitute each other. For sure, but I think there is also a question again of countervailing power. So states do all sorts of things. They can act as enforcers of capitalist social relations. As you noted, as Sven noted earlier, they can also, redistribute. They are, if you want, mechanisms of, if you want, a kind of countervailing tendencies to, assumed logics of capital. And I'm curious about that. I'm curious about, opening up the black box of the state and asking in what ways, have its mechanisms and powers been used both to enhance the power of capital, but also to channel it or circumscribe it in certain ways. States, educate, they redistribute, they tax, they vaccinate, they invest in public goods. They do all these things. The states have obviously killed and incarcerated. The state is a complex beast. I want to know more about it. That's sort of where I'm coming from.
Hi, Stefan. This is Heather. I am not sure I'm going to be able to do this in an articulate way because you had the luck of going on the last session, and so my brain is pretty tired. I don't disagree at all that states are important. I think they are very much. I'm not, and I don't disagree that economic aspects are important, or that in anti-colonial nationalism. But I'm wondering, there's a body of work, including Cindy Ewing's work on petitions in the UN and Jeff Burns' Mecca of Revolution, that shows that one of the reasons why states proliferate in the era of decolonization and look just exactly like the other states that already existed has to do with the conditions at the time. And so, I mean, it's not necessarily that it's the best thing, but there's a lot of pressure around existing formations that the decolonizing states couldn't really get out of. And I guess that's what Cindy Ewing is talking about in her work, and also Jeff Byrne. And so I wonder if you have a response to that.
Yeah. So I think my response to that would be to simply say, I think we're too quick to assume that the outcome of these political restructurings are ultimately formed by informal empire. That would be, I think, actually giving not enough agency to the designs of successful anti-colonial movements that want independence. Again, sort of asking, what's the point of statehood in the first place? I'll go back to my example of excuse me, India. My sense is, if one reads across kind of the discourse of Indian nationalism, say since the founding of the Indian National Congress, it's clear that their economic demands, increasingly push against any kind of federative idea with the British Empire, which was around for, which was one of the many ideas. Obviously, it took time to sort of percolate. It was simply clear that this couldn't be arranged without some sort of substantial sovereignty, and this is when you see kind of the turn to calls for full sovereignty. The other point I would make is, there is this scholarship which is wonderful. I'm thinking Fred Cooper or Adam Getachews books on, if you want, the kind of post-colonial imagination, which was not necessarily geared immediately towards the nation state. Again, ideas of federation, be they, Fred Cooper talked about West African ideas of federation within a reformed French Empire. Adam Getachew talks about, these Caribbean ideas about Caribbean federations. And I think, there's some important literature because, again, it explodes the kind of idea that there is a pure modernization narrative and the necessary emergence of nation state, but it doesn't ultimately explain why we end up with the world that we end up with. I think, regarding the West African case, Sam Moyne said this a while ago already. There was just never, in fact, a kind of co-equal imperial federation on the table. Regarding, other federative ideas, this was the problem of development, that South-South solidarity in economic terms is incredibly hard to pull off because you needed capital and technology, and that was available in the North. So you end up, yes, I think these are structural pressures. There is political pressures, but these are structural pressures. And, again, this is not by no means to deny the hierarchy, and, all nation states look the same on paper, obviously. Their state capacity is radically divergent. But I think all of them aspire to the state capacity to, re-engineer this global division of labor, which is inherited from imperialism.
Okay, we have time for 3 questions. Sven, and then Heidi Turek online, and then we'll end with Nicholas Lamb.
Hi, Stefan. I think
Hi.
now the camera is going to move towards me, maybe. There it's coming. Okay, you're going to see me in a second. But this was a great talk. Thank you so much. Wonderful. And I couldn't agree more with you that, the main story of the 20th century is definitely decolonialization, and that is very much about the capturing of state power. So I very much agree with this. But what I wanted to ask you is, I agree with all you say, but how to do it? I mean, how do you envision such a global history of states to be written?
That's a great question. And where could one begin? I mean, obviously, there's kind of interest comes out of my own work, where I simply looked at the percolation of mass production technology and how states were really interested in getting their hands on it. So, kind of state orchestrated technology transfers, I think, would be one thing to think about how states have actually gone about this. And this would kind of I wonder how. So another thing is, this often entails looking at the interfaces between, say, development-oriented states and multinational corporations. And I understand that this is incredibly hard to research because, again, most corporations in the 20th century, we can't access their files. So it would probably have to be investigated from the state angle. And also, this stuff is, as long as it's strategic or high profile, is incredibly difficult to research. But sort of that will be a research question: the interactions between states and multinational corporations, which is always this complicated dance, because multinational corporations are obviously incredibly powerful. They bring the capital, but states, have certain interests in what can they do. And the examples are just fascinating. I mentioned China. I'm not an expert on China, but so trying to understand what's going on there in the paper, how the strategy towards foreign capital changes from an idea, a hope that if you bring in foreign corporations, foreign capital en masse, and force them into joint ventures, that somehow there will be a technology spillover. And turns out it doesn't happen. Foreign multinationals just do not share proprietary technology. And then the Chinese change tack. And this is, essentially the story of the mid 2000s. And you emerge with a very, very different kind of development, strategy of development. So I think it would be these kinds of questions that I'm interested in. One more thing I'll say is political histories of state institutions, I think, would bring us very far. There's a remarkable book by two historians of technology, John Kriege and Mario Daniels, on the American export control system, which I also footnote in the paper here. Very few people even know that the American export control system exists. In fact, it's huge and pervasive. It's a kind of national security state system that makes sure that all the remarkable technology that is developed as part of this relentless state-driven innovation drive does not find its way to technological or strategic competitors, which is obviously incredibly hard to do. But there's an enormous bureaucracy, and Daniels and Kriege, wrote a political history of this, and it's incredibly interesting to see how this system evolves since World War II under the pressures of changing domestic coalitions and politics. A history of, again, a kind of political history of state institutions that manage what we call borders. A political history of the visa system. Managing labor migration. These kinds of things, could then be comparatively scaled. Something like that. This is what I think would help our understanding of the kind of structuring role that the states have played.
Hi, Stefan. I think you can see Heidi's question, but I'll just read it out for everyone that's here.
Oh, okay.
So she said, where does the literature on red globalization fit, i.e. the global history with activist socialist states? Example, Oscar Sanchez-Siboni. This has been a swiftly growing literature over the past few years that shows how global history does engage with states and point out new connections like East-South.
Yeah, Oscar's work has been kind of influential, really, in my own work. I would say it fits right in there. What Oscar has done, in his 2 books and many articles, is really show that the Soviet Union cannot be considered a kind of cut off or separate entity in the global economic system as it emerges in the 20th century, but rather interacts in strategic ways with the perils and opportunities of, well, markets for capital and technology, as all late developers do. And it does so under immense constraints because it's on the other side of the Cold War and, for example, for reasons of the American export control system and, re-dollarization everywhere except for the Soviet Union after World War II. It does this with enormous constraints, but it acts very much within the logic of states trying to take advantage of certain opportunities and constraints. So I think what I like about Oscar's work and what has informed my own work is that it allows us to view, to overcome these Cold War divides of complete systemic, if you want, incommensurability, which from a world systems perspective never made much sense. The history on Soviet South relations, I think the most fruitful way that this is kind of East-East or East-South relations, the most fruitful way in which this has been pursued is to think about what are the strategies beyond the kind of Cold War necessities of not the ideological exigencies, but what are some of the economic strategies that underlie this? So I'm thinking about work on the GDR hiring. Laborers, workers from Africa and friendly socialist countries in the 1980s. In a situation of, in fact, of a kind of labor skill shortage, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I like that part of this literature that indeed. That works in this. And actually, you're right, Heidi. That is a good example in the way in which this has often been done. I think the idea of sometimes this literature, as I think cannot escape the overall critique, or I think is subject to, is amenable to this critique that I picked up on in the very beginning, that it's overly interested, sometimes too interested in establishing connections or processes of intercultural connection, and too focused on connection at the expense of a structure. But that will be kind of my only kind of gripe.
We're out of time, so briefly, if we can just take Nicholas's question and then conclude for today.
Thank you. Nicholas Lamp here from the Faculty of Law here at Queen's. Thanks for the fascinating talk. You talked a lot about the International Division of Labor and how states were trying to challenge that. And that's, of course, incredibly current at the moment. Canada just imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And following the US example, the EU just imposed tariffs as well. And I was just wondering, when you look at the debates around the International Division of Labor in the past, in the 80s, maybe in period of decolonization, and compared to now, like with these concerns that we have about Chinese overcapacity, like very briefly, what do you see as the parallels, and is there something qualitatively different about the challenge from China?
So I think it's not qualitatively differently. It is different. I think it fits the very same pattern. I mean, one perspective open up by one history open up by this perspective is precisely the kind of cycles of state orchestrated development, which lead to underdevelopment in other places, and cycles of competitive development, which lead to cycles of industrialization and deindustrialization. In that sense, the fact that what you see today what you just mentioned, this, if you want, resurgence of economic nationalism, the renewed tariffs, industrial policy, et cetera, is really, just another cycle in an ongoing cycle. We've been there before, vis-a-vis Japan. Sort of in the 1970s and 80s. Yeah, it's often forgotten how pervasive this was as kind of shaping and informing politics, and it was eclipsed by this moment of triumphalism. Perhaps there's going to be a new moment of triumphalism. But to my sense, these cycles are recurring. Is this a new challenge? I mean, I'll just say this: there is talk of the Second Cold War, now the Cold War against China. It's very clear. You're also drawing on Sanchez-Siboni's work that over the course of the 20th century, the Soviet Union, space race notwithstanding, nuclear parity notwithstanding, the Soviet Union, in fact, encountered always faced the United States from a position of structural economic weakness. I don't think that's the case for China. So I very much hope we can avoid a second Cold War. I think it's unnecessary. I would like to see more talk about complementarities. But I think the challenge is of course much more substantial, and so that the reaction is accordingly strong. I think is therefore understandable. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the close of the conference. Thank you, Stefan.